The morning I realized my lake had been poisoned started with a smell I'd never noticed in 60 years of family history. The air carried a sharp metallic bite as I stepped out of my truck and walked toward the water, boots crunching slowly over the gravel path my father laid down back in 1978. And before I even reached the shoreline, I could see something was wrong, because Carter Lake usually shimmered like dark glass in the Texas sun, but that morning the surface looked dull and lifeless. The kind of stillness that makes your gut tighten before your brain catches up. A few fish floated near the reeds, not thrashing, not dramatic, just drifting in the slow morning current like leaves that didn't belong there, and the faint smell of chemicals mixed with the warm scent of wet earth and cedar trees. I stood there for a second listening to the quiet, the distant hum of sprinklers from the Willow Creek subdivision up the hill, and the soft slap of water against the old wooden dock my grandfather built with a hammer and a stubborn sense of pride. My name is Daniel Carter, and that lake isn't just scenery behind my house. My grandfather dug the original basin with rented equipment and a lot of stubborn sweat sometime around 1964, long before subdivisions, HOA boards, and perfectly trimmed lawns started creeping into this valley. My father expanded it later, shaping the shoreline by hand and running the overflow channel himself. And when I was a kid, the three of us spent entire summers standing knee-deep in the shallows, casting lines into water so clear you could see the base turn before they hit the hook. Carter Lake was the one thing my family never sold when developers started circling this land like vultures 20 years ago. They built Willow Creek estates uphill anyway, rows of identical beige houses, 2-car garages, automatic sprinklers hissing every morning at exactly 6 a.m., and somewhere along the way the Homeowners Association elected a president named Linda Whitmore. If you've ever met the type, you can picture her already. White Lexus SUV. Perfect hair that never moves in the wind. Clipboard always tucked under one arm like a badge of authority. Linda believed the entire valley existed for the aesthetic comfort of Willow Creek residents, and for years she'd been trying to convince me that my lake should fall under community management. I said no every time. The lake sits on my property, the deed is older than the subdivision, and fishing there on Saturday mornings is about the only quiet habit I've got left. That's why the sign staked into the mud near my dock stopped me cold that morning. Fresh whiteboard. Black letters. Fishing prohibited. Willow Creek HOA Environmental Protection Notice. I remember staring at it while the wind pushed small ripples across the water and the chemical smell lingered in the air, and somewhere behind those quiet ripples my patience snapped like a dry branch. Because one thing about Linda Whitmore is she never does anything halfway. If she put up a sign like that, it meant the HOA had already decided the lake belonged to them. What she didn't know yet was that every house in Willow Creek depended on that lake for something far more important than fishing. The first thing I did was kneel down at the edge of the water and scoop a handful into my palm. Carter Lake had always smelled like clean mud and cedar roots after a warm night. But that morning the scent was different, sharp and bitter, like the inside of an old toolbox left in the rain. I let the water drip slowly through my fingers and watched the surface ripple across the shallows where bluegill usually swarmed this time of year. Nothing moved. No flicker of fins. No quick silver flash beneath the dock. Just quiet water and that metallic smell hanging in the warm Texas air. I stood up and looked back at the sign again, the whiteboard planted deep in the mud like someone wanted it to stay there a long time. Willow Creek HOA Environmental Protection Notice. That was Linda Whitmore all over again. She loved the sound of official words, especially when they were printed in bold letters. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and snapped a few photos of the sign, the water, the shoreline. Then I walked the entire edge of the lake the way my father used to when he was checking the overflow channel after heavy rain. The gravel crunched under my boots and cicadas buzzed in the trees while the morning sun climbed over the ridge behind the subdivision. Halfway around the lake, I found the second clue. A faint blue stain along the rocks near the inlet pipe where runoff water sometimes trickled in from the hills. It was subtle, almost like someone spilled paint and tried to wash it away, but I recognized the color immediately. Years ago, I worked 2 summers with a county water management crew while I was finishing college, and we used a chemical with that exact shade during controlled algae treatments. Copper sulfate. The kind of compound that clears algae blooms in ponds and reservoirs when applied carefully. Used wrong, though, It throws an entire ecosystem off balance. The fish do not die dramatically. They simply disappear from the food chain until the water settles again. I stood there staring at that faint blue streak while the wind carried the distant sound of lawn mowers from Willow Creek Estates up on the hill. Someone in that neighborhood woke up early this morning and decided my lake needed to be treated like a community project. That thought sat in my chest for a minute while the sun warmed the back of my neck. I pulled out my phone again and dialed the number printed at the bottom of the sign. The call rang 3 times before a calm, recorded voice answered. Willow Creek Homeowners Association office. Please leave a message after the tone. I did not leave one. Instead, I turned back toward the dock and studied the far ridge where the identical rooftops of the subdivision lined up like a row of beige dominoes against the sky. Every sprinkler system in that neighborhood ran on the same schedule. 6 o'clock every morning. You could hear them from down here when the wind carried the sound across the valley. Hiss. Pause. Hiss again. The rhythm of a perfectly managed neighborhood. Linda Whitmore believed everything in Willow Creek should operate that smoothly, including land she did not own. I bent down once more and looked at the lake water moving slowly around the dock posts. Whatever they had added was still spreading through the shallows. The smell of metal was stronger now. I could already picture the emergency HOA meeting where Linda stood at the front of the clubhouse with that same confident smile she used when explaining new rules about mailbox colors or approved fence heights. In her mind, this lake was probably just another problem she had solved for the community. What she had not realized yet was that Carter Lake had been quietly connected to that community long before Willow Creek Estates ever existed. I left the shoreline just as the sun climbed high enough to burn the morning haze off the valley, and by the time I reached my truck, the sprinklers in Willow Creek Estates had already started their daily chorus. From down by the lake, they sounded like distant steam valves opening and closing across the hill, steady and precise, the kind of rhythm that tells you everything up there runs on a schedule. Linda Whitmore loved schedules. Neighborhood meetings on the first Tuesday of every month. Lawn inspections every other Saturday morning. I had attended exactly one of those meetings 3 years ago when the subdivision tried to convince me to sign a voluntary land use agreement. I still remember the smell of coffee and lemon cleaning spray inside the clubhouse while Linda stood at the front of the room with a slideshow about community standards. She had that same calm smile she used when explaining that Carter Lake would be a wonderful shared recreational resource if I would just cooperate with the association. I told her the same thing my father used to say whenever developers came knocking. The lake is private property. The discussion ended there. Or at least I thought it did. I drove the gravel road that curved up toward the main highway, passing the cedar fence posts my grandfather set in the ground more than 40 years ago, and every few seconds the smell of the lake water lingered on my hands where it had dried in the morning heat. Copper sulfate. Someone had brought that chemical to the shoreline on purpose. That was not the kind of thing that drifts in by accident. At the county agricultural supply store in town, I bought 3 clean sampling bottles and filled them at the outdoor tap before driving straight back to the lake. The valley was fully awake now. Cicadas buzzing in the oak trees. A pickup truck rumbling along the subdivision entrance road above the ridge. The lake itself still looked wrong. The surface was calm, but empty in a way that made the whole place feel hollow. I crouched down at 3 different points along the shoreline and filled the bottles carefully the way the water management crew taught me years ago. One from the shallow reeds near the dock. One from the blue-stained rocks by the inlet. One from the deeper water at the old overflow channel. The plastic caps clicked tight, and the faint metallic smell lingered in the air while I labeled each bottle with a marker from the glove box. Sample 1. Dock. 8:43 in the morning. Sample 2. Inlet pipe. 8:47. Sample 3. Spillway. 8:52. I placed them carefully in a cooler and closed the lid. The moment the latch snapped shut, I heard tires on gravel behind me. A white Lexus SUV rolled slowly down the dirt path toward the lake and stopped beside the fence line like it owned the place. The driver door opened and Linda Whitmore stepped out holding a familiar clipboard against her side. She wore running shoes and a light blue athletic jacket like she had just finished a casual walk through the neighborhood. From the calm look on her face, you would never guess anything unusual had happened at this lake that morning. She walked toward the shoreline without hurry, studying the sign planted near the dock as if admiring the placement. Then she looked at me and smiled the same careful smile I remembered from the clubhouse meeting. "Good morning, Daniel," she said in that soft neighborhood management voice she liked to use. "I see you found the notice." I glanced at the cooler beside my truck and then back at the water stretching across the valley floor. "Yes," I said slowly. "I noticed the lake looks different today." Linda followed my gaze toward the shoreline, where the faint blue stains still marked the rocks near the inlet. Her expression did not change. "We had a small environmental treatment done overnight," she said matter-of-factly. "Purely precautionary for community health. Fishing will be suspended until further notice." She said it the way someone might announce a temporary pool closure at a country club. Calm. Official. Already decided. What she did not realize standing there beside my dock was that the samples sitting inside that cooler were about to tell a very different story about what had really happened to Carter Lake. For a moment neither of us spoke, and the only sound was the wind moving slowly across the lake, pushing small ripples against the dock posts while the morning sun climbed higher over the ridge. Linda Whitmore stood a few yards away with that same calm expression, clipboard resting against her hip like this was just another routine inspection, and I could almost hear the gears turning behind her eyes as she studied the water. She believed she was in control of the situation. People like Linda always did. I leaned against the side of my truck and folded my arms. "Environmental treatment," I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the warm air. "That sounds like a pretty big decision for property that does not belong to the association." Linda gave a small polite laugh, the kind people use when they think they are explaining something obvious. "Daniel, this lake directly affects the entire Willow Creek community. When there is a potential environmental concern, we have a responsibility to act." Her voice carried that practiced tone she used in HOA meetings, calm and confident, like she was reading from a rule book nobody else had seen. I glanced out across the water again and then back at her. "So the association decided to treat it overnight." She nodded once. "We hired a licensed contractor. Completely standard procedure." The way she said it made the whole thing sound harmless, like they had trimmed a few hedges or repainted a mailbox. But the faint metallic smell drifting from the shoreline told a different story. I walked a few steps toward the dock and pointed down at the water. "Copper sulfate is not something you casually dump into a lake without a permit." Linda's smile tightened just a little at the corners, but it never disappeared. "Our contractor assured us the application was safe." I turned and opened the cooler sitting in the bed of my truck. The plastic bottles clinked softly as I lifted one into the sunlight. The water inside looked perfectly clear, but the label across the side told the real story. "Dock sample. 8:43 in the morning." I set it on the tailgate beside the other two bottles and closed the cooler again. Linda's eyes flicked toward them for half a second. "Just collecting a few samples," I said. "Old habit from when I worked with the county water management team." The wind shifted and carried the distant hiss of sprinklers again from the houses above the ridge. Linda followed the sound with her eyes for a moment before looking back at me. "Daniel, the association is simply protecting the community." She said the word community the way someone might say family, like it automatically justified whatever came next. I rested my hands on the tailgate and studied the valley stretching beyond the lake. Rows of rooftops caught the sunlight up on the hill, and the steady rhythm of irrigation systems continued across the neighborhood lawns. Everything up there depended on water moving through pipes and pumps and storage tanks that most residents probably never thought about. Linda Whitmore certainly did not look worried about any of that as she adjusted the papers on her clipboard. In her mind, the problem had already been solved. The lake had been treated. Fishing had been suspended. The HOA had taken control of the situation. I closed the cooler lid slowly and latched it shut with a soft click. "Well," I said calmly, "the lab in town usually turns around water tests in about 24 hours. Linda tilted her head slightly, still smiling. "I am sure everything will come back perfectly normal." I looked out across the quiet water one more time, and then back toward the subdivision rising above the ridge. The faint blue stain near the inlet was still visible from where we stood. "Maybe," I said, "but if the levels are high enough to shut down a private lake." I let the rest of the sentence trail off while the wind carried the smell of treated water across the shoreline. Linda's expression remained polite, but the silence between us stretched just a little longer this time, because neither of us had said it out loud yet. But somewhere beyond those rooftops and sprinkler systems, deep in the plumbing of Willow Creek estates, The entire neighborhood was connected to the same water source that Linda Whitmore had just decided to treat. The cooler rode beside me on the passenger seat as I drove into town, and the faint smell of lake water still clung to my hands even after I washed them at the gas station sink. The road curved through 2 miles of scrub oak and dry pasture before the first buildings appeared. The same quiet Texas town that had barely changed since my father used to bring me here for fishing licenses and hardware supplies. The environmental testing lab sat behind a tire shop and a feed store, a plain concrete building with a faded sign that read Hill County Water Analysis. I carried the cooler inside, and the woman at the front desk looked up from a computer screen with the kind of calm expression that comes from spending years around farmers, ranchers, and well owners who worry about their water. I set the bottles on the counter one by one and explained where the samples came from. She wrote the details down carefully, labeling each bottle with a barcode sticker before sliding them into a plastic tray. "Results should be ready by tomorrow afternoon," she said. I thanked her, stepped back into the heat, and stood for a moment beside my truck watching the dust swirl across the parking lot. 24 hours. That was all it would take for the numbers to confirm what my nose already knew. The drive back toward the valley felt quieter than usual. When I reached the hill overlooking Willow Creek Estates, I slowed down just long enough to take in the view. The neighborhood looked exactly the way the developer brochures promised 15 years ago. Clean sidewalks, freshly trimmed lawns, roof lines lined up in neat rows across the slope like someone had arranged them with a ruler. Sprinklers still pulsed across the grass in steady arcs of water that caught the sunlight like tiny rainbows. From a distance it looked peaceful, perfect even. The kind of place where homeowners associations like to believe they control every detail of daily life. I continued down the gravel road toward the lake and parked beside the fence line again. Linda Whitmore's white sign still stood near the dock where she had planted it that morning. The wind had shifted slightly, and the chemical scent drifting across the water was a little weaker now, but the lake still felt different somehow, like the balance of the place had been nudged out of alignment. I walked the shoreline again slowly, hands in my pockets, watching the water move through the reeds where small fish usually scattered at the sound of footsteps. Nothing moved. The quiet stretched across the lake like a held breath. By late afternoon, the sun settled low enough to cast long shadows from the cedar trees along the bank. Up on the ridge, the houses of Willow Creek glowed orange. In the evening light, while the steady hiss of irrigation systems continued across the neighborhood lawns. I leaned against the old dock rail and listened to that sound for a long time. Every one of those sprinklers depended on water moving through the infrastructure buried beneath that neighborhood. Pipes, pumps, emergency storage lines most residents probably never even thought about. Years ago, when the county updated the valley water system, my father and I had studied the engineering plans together out of simple curiosity. He liked understanding how things worked beneath the surface. One particular detail had stayed with me ever since. A small intake connection linking Carter Lake to the subdivision's backup water supply system, designed decades earlier when drought conditions forced the county to build emergency access points for rural developments. Most people in Willow Creek probably had no idea that connection existed. They turned on their kitchen faucets and saw clean water flow. They watched their lawns turn green each summer and never thought about where that water might come from during a dry season. Standing there beside the quiet lake that evening, I realized Linda Whitmore probably had not thought about it either. She had looked at Carter Lake and seen a problem she wanted to control. She had organized a contractor, printed a notice, and treated the water like it was part of her neighborhood management plan. The lab results would arrive tomorrow, and numbers have a way of turning small decisions into very large consequences. I rested my hands on the weathered dock rail and watched the last sunlight slide across the lake, while the sprinklers continued hissing across Willow Creek Estates above the ridge, sending thousands of gallons of water through pipes that were quietly connected to the very lake they had decided to treat. The next morning, the valley felt different before I even stepped outside. The air was still and warm, and the faint smell from the lake had faded slightly overnight, but the quiet carried a strange tension that I could not quite explain. I brewed a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table watching the sunlight spread across the hills until my phone vibrated against the wood. The caller ID read Hill County Water Analysis. I answered immediately. The woman from the lab sounded calm the same way she had the day before, but her voice carried The careful tone professionals use when the numbers on a report are not routine. She confirmed the sample labels and then read the results slowly. Copper sulfate concentration far above normal treatment levels. High enough to temporarily disrupt aquatic balance in a small freshwater body the size of Carter Lake. My eyes drifted toward the window where the lake shimmered faintly between the trees. Would that level require official reporting? I asked. There was a pause while she reviewed the numbers again. Yes, she said finally. At that concentration, we recommend notifying the county environmental office. It is considered chemical contamination if applied without a regulated permit. I thanked her and ended the call. For a long moment, I just sat there listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of morning traffic somewhere beyond the valley road. The numbers confirmed exactly what I suspected. Someone had applied enough chemical treatment to change the water chemistry of the entire lake. That was not maintenance. That was intervention. I carried my coffee out onto the porch and looked up toward Willow Creek Estates where the rooftops caught the morning sun in clean straight lines across the ridge. The neighborhood looked calm as always. Sprinklers hissed across green lawns. A dog barked somewhere near the entrance road. A delivery truck rolled slowly past the clubhouse parking lot. Life up there continued like nothing unusual had happened. I went back inside and opened the drawer where my father used to keep old property documents and county maps. Most of the papers were decades old, yellowed slightly around the edges from years of handling, but the engineering drawings were still clear. I spread one across the table and traced the lines with my finger. The county water infrastructure plan from the early 1980s showed every major pipe and emergency intake across the valley. My father and I had studied this exact drawing years ago out of curiosity during a dry summer when the county warned residents about potential drought restrictions. I followed the thin blue line printed across the map until it reached the familiar label beside Carter Lake. Emergency Auxiliary Intake Connection. The pipe ran underground along the eastern ridge and tied directly into the Willow Creek Estates backup supply system near the community pump station. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the map for a long moment while the quiet kitchen filled with morning light. The connection existed for a simple reason. If the subdivision ever lost pressure from the primary municipal line during drought or equipment failure, the system could draw water from Carter Lake as an emergency reserve source. It was a rarely used safeguard built decades before the subdivision even existed. Most residents probably had no idea it was there. The association board likely never thought about it at all. I folded the map carefully and placed it back in the drawer. Then I picked up the lab report email that had arrived while I was studying the drawings. The chemical concentration numbers were printed clearly across the screen, high enough to qualify as contamination if the lake served as part of a regulated water system. I stepped outside again and looked across the quiet valley toward the rooftops above the ridge. Somewhere beneath those streets and driveways, the emergency pipe still connected their neighborhood infrastructure to the water resting calmly in Carter Lake. Linda Whitmore had decided to treat the lake like a problem she could solve with a contractor and a clipboard. What she had not realized was that the lake was quietly tied into the same system her neighborhood depended on when things stopped working perfectly. The rest of that morning moved slowly, but my mind did not. Once you understand how a system is connected, you cannot unsee it. And every time I looked toward the ridge where Willow Creek Estate sat in perfect suburban order, the pieces of the situation became clearer. The association believed they had solved a problem by treating the lake. They believed they had authority because they had printed a sign and hired a contractor. What they had actually done was introduce a regulated chemical into a water body that sat directly on top of a backup supply connection, feeding their own infrastructure. I finished my coffee, printed the laboratory report, and drove into town again. The county environmental office occupied a small brick building near the courthouse square where the American flag moved slowly in the warm breeze above the parking lot. Inside the building, the air conditioning hummed quietly, and the front desk clerk greeted me with the calm familiarity that comes from living in a town where most people know each other by name. I explained that I needed to report a possible chemical contamination in a private lake that might connect to a municipal auxiliary supply line. The phrase alone was enough to change the tone of the conversation. Within 10 minutes, a county environmental officer named Mark Henderson joined me in a small meeting room with a clipboard and a stack of forms. I handed him the printed laboratory report along with the map copy I had brought from home. Mark studied the numbers first and then followed the line on the map with a finger, tracing the route of the auxiliary pipe that ran from Carter Lake toward the Willow Creek pump station. The room stayed quiet for a moment while he reviewed both documents. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. If those levels are accurate, he said carefully, any introduction of copper sulfate without permit authorization qualifies as unregulated chemical application in a water source connected to an emergency municipal supply. The way he said it made the situation sound larger than a simple neighborhood dispute. Because it was. The moment a water body becomes part of a backup infrastructure network, it falls under environmental oversight, whether people realize it or not. I told him exactly what I had seen the previous morning. The blue staining near the inlet rocks. The new sign placed by the Homeowners Association. The statement from Linda Whitmore describing an overnight environmental treatment arranged by the HOA. Mark wrote everything down slowly and asked a few clarifying questions about the location of the lake and the timeline of events. Then he placed the lab report back on the table and nodded once. We will need to notify the State Water Authority and temporarily review the Willow Creek auxiliary intake connection, he said. The words were simple, but the implications behind them were not. An investigation meant inspectors. Inspectors meant infrastructure checks. And infrastructure checks meant the entire connection between Carter Lake and Willow Creek estates would suddenly appear on the radar of agencies that take water systems very seriously. I thanked him, left the office, and stepped back into the bright Texas sunlight outside the courthouse. The square was quiet except for a pickup truck rolling slowly past the old diner on the corner. I stood beside my truck for a moment looking back toward the road that led into the valley, somewhere beyond those trees. And hills the lake sat quietly beneath the afternoon sun, and above it the rooftops of Willow Creek estates still looked calm and orderly from a distance. Linda Whitmore probably believed the situation was already finished. The lake had been treated. The notice had been posted. The Homeowners Association had taken control of the problem. What she did not know yet was that the moment those lab results were filed with the county environmental office, the entire situation stopped being a neighborhood decision and started becoming a regulatory one. 2 days later, the first county truck rolled into the valley just after sunrise. I heard the engine long before I saw it, because the road that runs past Carter Lake carries sound across the water like a drum. When I stepped out onto the porch, the morning air was cool and still, and the lake looked almost normal again. The metallic smell nearly gone, but the memory of it still sitting in the back of my mind. A white county pickup with the Environmental Services logo on the door slowed near the shoreline and parked beside the gravel path where Linda Whitmore had stood with her clipboard earlier in the week. Another truck followed behind it, this one carrying equipment cases in the bed. 2 inspectors stepped out and walked toward the dock while the sun climbed slowly over the ridge behind Willow Creek Estates. They moved calmly and methodically, the way professionals do when they are not there to argue, but to measure. One of them crouched near the inlet rocks where the faint blue stain still lingered while the other began setting up a testing probe near the spillway channel. I walked down the path to meet them and introduced myself. They already knew the name Carter Lake from the county report. One inspector held up a clipboard with the same lab numbers I had received 2 mornings earlier. We are verifying contamination levels and checking the auxiliary intake connection, he said in a steady voice. The words sounded simple, but the meaning behind them echoed across the valley. Above us, the rooftops of Willow Creek Estates were just beginning to catch the early sunlight. Sprinklers were running again across the lawns, and the quiet hiss of water carried through the trees exactly the way it always did. From the ridge, the neighborhood probably looked down at the lake without thinking about it at all. Just a quiet body of water in the valley below. A few minutes later, another vehicle arrived, this one from the State Water Authority. The inspectors greeted each other like colleagues who had done this kind of review many times before. They walked the shoreline together, checking sample points, recording coordinates, and tracing the route of the old auxiliary pipe connection marked on the county infrastructure map. One of them eventually nodded toward the eastern ridge where the underground line ran beneath the soil toward Willow Creek Estates. That intake connection is still active in the emergency system, he said, which means the lake qualifies as a potential supply source. The explanation did not need to go any further than that. Once a water body is tied into a regulated supply network, the rules around it become very clear. Unpermitted chemical application becomes a reportable environmental event. and reportable events lead to operational decisions. By mid-morning, the inspectors had finished their measurements and gathered beside the dock to review their notes. The wind had picked up slightly and small ripples moved across the surface of Carter Lake, while sunlight reflected off the water in bright flashes. One of the state officers finally closed his folder and spoke with the same calm tone the lab technician had used on the phone 2 days earlier. Until the contamination level returns to acceptable baseline standards, the auxiliary intake connection to Willow Creek Estates must remain suspended. I watched him write the notice on the form, and the moment the pen lifted from the page, the situation shifted quietly but permanently. Up on the ridge, the houses of Willow Creek Estates still looked calm in the morning light. Lawns were still green. Sprinklers still moved across the grass. But somewhere beneath those streets and driveways, the emergency connection that linked their neighborhood infrastructure to Carter Lake had just been officially shut down for review. And the homeowners association that believed it had solved a problem overnight was about to learn that water systems do not respond well to decisions made without understanding how they are connected. By the following week, the valley had settled back into its usual quiet rhythm. But the ripple from what happened at Carter Lake had traveled farther than most people in Willow Creek Estates expected. The State Water Authority completed its review faster than anyone predicted, because once a contamination report enters the regulatory system, it moves with a certain quiet efficiency. Inspectors returned twice more to confirm the chemical levels had begun to fall back toward normal range, and every visit left another line of documentation attached to the official record. The auxiliary intake connection remained closed during that entire process. Up on the ridge, the neighborhood still looked neat and orderly from a distance. But word had started to circulate among residents that the county had temporarily suspended part of their emergency water infrastructure. The explanation was simple enough for anyone willing to read the notice posted by the county office. Unregulated chemical treatment had been introduced into a water body connected to the auxiliary system. Until the source returned to acceptable environmental standards, the connection could not be used. I spent most of those days walking the shoreline the same way my father used to, watching the balance of the lake slowly return. The faint metallic scent faded from the air, and the water regained its usual dark clarity beneath the afternoon sun. Small ripples moved through the reeds again, and one evening I saw the first flash of a base turning beneath the dock. Life in a lake always returns quietly once the chemistry settles. Late one afternoon, I heard tires on gravel again and looked up from the dock to see the familiar white Lexus SUV pulling slowly toward the fence line. Linda Whitmore stepped out holding the same clipboard she always carried, but this time her confident stride had softened slightly. She walked down the path and stopped beside the dock rail, where the water moved calmly beneath the boards. For a moment she said nothing, just watched the surface of the lake while a light breeze carried the sound of distant sprinklers across the valley. Finally she cleared her throat. The county informed us the auxiliary connection will remain suspended until the lake fully stabilizes, she said carefully. The words sounded different from the confident tone she had used a week earlier. They carried the weight of a lesson learned through paperwork and official letters. I rested my hands on the weathered dock rail and looked out across the water where sunlight shimmered between the small ripples. Water systems are complicated, I said quietly. Linda nodded once and glanced toward the far shoreline where the faint blue stain on the rocks had already begun to fade. She adjusted the papers on her clipboard but did not open them. For the first time since I had known her, she looked less like a neighborhood manager and more like someone reconsidering a decision. The wind moved softly through the cedar trees, and the quiet of the valley returned again. After a moment, she turned and walked back toward her car without another word. I stayed at the dock watching the lake for a while longer until the evening light began to settle over the hills. Up on the ridge, Willow Creek Estates still looked the same as it always had. Rows of houses catching the warm orange glow of sunset, while sprinklers whispered across green lawns. But somewhere beneath those streets, the auxiliary connection that once linked their neighborhood to Carter Lake remained closed for review, and the association that believed it could control everything inside the valley had finally learned something simple about water and land. Ownership is quiet. Authority is quiet. And real consequences move just as calmly as the surface of a lake after the wind stops.